U.S. officials said the United States was simply incapable of delivering on. So clearly, during the course of the last few months, it became clear that, as President Biden said, this wasn't a choice. Russia was only willing to offer up a deal that included Brittney Griner and not Paul Whelan. We're waiting to hear when that actually, changed, right? Because U.S. officials had been repeatedly saying that their offer was for both of these Americans to be released. It's also important to note that the Secretary of State put out a statement today thanking the entire State Department team who had been working on this. We know that there was the intelligence community that was also working on this deal, but Roger Carstens, the special representative for hostage affairs here at the State Department, according to Blinken, is now with Brittney Griner. Of course, they are headed home. And I also think it's important to note that what Paul Whelan's brother said on CNN earlier is that this was the right decision for the Biden administration to make. He welcomed the fact that Brittney Griner is coming home. But the real question here is how Paul Whelan will now be able to get home, because he said in his statement that it's clear that the United States doesn't now have any concessions to offer Russia, because we know that Russia really wanted Viktor Bout. Now they've gotten him. So he's kind of questioning what else could they offer up to get Paul Whelan home.
Yeah. Listen, honorable comments from the Whelan family at a moment that has to be disappointing for them. They're happy for the Griner family, but of course, devastating news that Paul Whelan not included there. Kylie Atwood at the State Department, thanks so much. CNN's Abby Phillip, anchor and host of Inside Politics, here with me. And you've been in touch and you interviewed Griner's wife, Sherelle, before. You've been in touch with her this morning. I imagine this is a happy day for her.
Yeah, I think even up until the last moment, there was a sense of hope, optimism, but holding of the breath until it happened. And then she got to that podium after President Biden spoke this morning and let out a huge sigh of relief. This has been, for her, as she said, the darkest time of her life. This is a young couple that's been through quite a lot together. I think we have a little bit of what she said from the podium. Let's play it.
Today, my family is whole, but as you all are aware, there's so many other families who are not whole. And so BG's not here to say this, but I will gladly speak on her behalf and say that BG and I will remain committed to the work of getting every American home, including Paul, whose family is in our hearts today. As we celebrate BG being home, we do understand that there are still people out here who are enduring what I endured the last 9 months of missing tremendously their loved ones.
And this is something that has definitely taken over Sherelle Griner's life, as it does for most of these families. A couple of things that just to kind of give you a sense of her frame of mind. When Sherelle Griner became one of these families, she was brought into the fold. I actually met her at an organization, the Foley Foundation. They had a gala dinner, and she was just in the first few weeks of this. And they really embraced her, those other families. But one of the things that became very clear was, like Paul Whelan and Trevor Reed, who was released earlier this year, they had been detained in Russia for years. And so there was a real prospect that this could go on for much longer. But as you know, Jim, I mean, Russia is not a hospitable place for Black people, for gay people. There was a deep fear here that she could be engulfed in a global struggle that was totally out of their control.
She was sentenced to 9 years. And these penal colonies, as they're known, they're labor camps. In effect, they're Stalinist labor camps. The conditions there are horrendous. And I'm sure that Sherelle, in your conversations with her, must have been worried about her state of mind, her state of health during that time.
Yeah, she was terrified. And early in the summer, when the first images came out of Brittney Griner as she was in detention going into court, and she had a really stunned look on her face. And I spoke to Sherelle shortly after that, and she said, you know, I talked to her. They were writing letters to each other. I talked to her and I said, you can't let them show you like that, because that's part of the propaganda campaign, she believed, was to make Brittney Griner seem almost animalistic in a cage, physically in a cage. So as we got further into the fall, I spoke to her again after she met at the White House with President Biden. Cherelle Griner was very hopeful, but she was also telling me she was deeply fearful about Brittney Griner's state of mind. This was before she was actually transferred to the penal colony. She felt like Brittney Griner was deteriorating mentally and emotionally under the conditions that she was in, and with the prospect that this could not be resolved.
The conditions designed to demean. Abby Phillip, thanks so much. And Erica, we should note as we discuss this that this was deliberate. These were trumped-up charges, the U.S. viewing her as wrongfully detained, and Russia has a habit of taking Americans and people of other nationalities as, in effect, bargaining chips so that they could use them for people like a Viktor Bout, who was convicted of far more serious crimes.
Absolutely. And as Abby just pointed out in her conversations with Cherelle Griner, her concerns that her wife, Brittney Griner, was being used as part of this propaganda campaign. What does that look like in Russia? CNN senior international correspondent Frederick Peikin with us, as well as Nick Payton-Walsh. So Fred, as we look at this and what is actually playing out on the ground there in Russia, you've reported extensively, obviously from inside Russia. You were there during the trial. How is this playing out this morning?
Well, first of all, the Russians are making it seem as though it's a big victory for Russia. Some of the statements that we're seeing from the Russian Foreign Ministry is that they said that they've been working on Viktor Bout's release for a very long time, that they said that the U.S. wasn't open to it for a very long time, but now that the moment was right. But of course, we know, also from what Kylie was just saying, that this went through a lot of up and downs along the way. That originally when the U.S. came out and said that, yes, they had put a substantial offer on the table to try and get Brittney Griner released, that the Russians were irate and said that they wanted to stop the entire process because all of it had to happen behind closed doors. And just a couple of days ago, guys, the Russians came out and said that they believed there were not going to be any further talks about prisoner swaps until the end of this year. So clearly something was going on behind the scenes, but the public messaging from the Russians was very different. And you know, one of the things I was just hearing Abby speak about what Brittney Griner went through, and obviously I saw that firsthand. And having been at her trial, it was one gut punch after the next for Brittney Griner at that trial. If you look at her legal team, they put together a really great defense for her. They had some witnesses who talked about the fact that some of the evidence gathering didn't happen even according to Russian law, that there were some problems with the analysis of those cartridges that allegedly contained the CBD oil, that the amount of cannabis in that was absolutely minute. I think it was 0.7 of a gram. And you had Brittney Griner, who was always sitting in a cage, who was brought in shackles to that cage, had to sit in there for hours on hand. She was always respectful to the court. She always talked about how much she respected Russia. She talked about how much she respected her teammates. There were character witnesses who testified to the fact that she did a lot for basketball in Russia, and that she did a lot for her team in Russia as well, in Yekaterinburg. But there was absolutely no leniency on the part of the court. And so all of this was one gut punch after the next. And I think one of the things that her legal team really spent a lot of time with was keeping her spirits up. By the way, the U.S. Embassy also played a big role in that, the U.S. Embassy in Moscow as well. And then, of course, she was brought to that penal colony. And I think it's just extremely difficult psychologically to come to terms with that because it just seems so final. So for her, it must be a big, big moment to finally be out of this.
Yeah, we should let folks know these are penal colonies. They were first built by Stalin. They're hundreds of miles from Moscow. They're designed to demean. They're labor camps, in effect. Nick Payton-Walsh, you were the last person to sit down with Viktor Bout for an interview. I've seen your interviews. He denied in those interviews that he was guilty of the crimes he was charged with. He called them BS. Fact is, though, those crimes were well documented. Tell us more about them.
Yeah, look, I mean, there's what he eventually found himself extradited to the United States from Thailand for, which was a complicated sting put forward by the DEA, US agents who were pretending to be Colombian terrorists and got Viktor Bout to essentially agree to supply them with a high-tech weaponry. That led to a lengthy extradition battle that got him extradited to the US, that led him to be convicted and put into a US jail. And then there's the career history, which is an extraordinary litany of crimes that Viktor Bout has denied. And they involve the proliferation of small arms, heavy arms across Africa during some of the nastiest wars there of the 90s and the early 2000s, and other accusations of arms trading. Frankly, you name it, in the 90s and early 2000s, if there was a war, there were accusations that Viktor Bout may have been involved supplying what the West would have considered to be the wrong side. He always denied that entirely. But Jim, that was the extraordinary paradox here. Why is a man who says he's basically just an innocent pilot and a businessman shipping foodstuffs or other materials around the world. Why is he of such extraordinary value to Moscow? A man that they spent thousands of us seemingly assisting his defense here and there, trying to get him back over the past decades, and now at a time of the worst relations between Moscow and Washington, possibly since the Cuban Missile Crisis, you might argue, this remarkable deal where a high-profile American held by Russia is switched for a possibly higher profile in the mind of Russians, in American custody. That's quite extraordinary. The broader theory about who Viktor Bout really was in the past is perhaps he was a man close to Russian intelligence. Again, he denies it. Perhaps he knew people who went on to be senior in Vladimir Putin's circle. He may have had information on them. That was another theory, again, that he denied. And so a man clearly of massive value to the Kremlin. They're obviously glad to have him home, but one whose real past has never been truly elucidated. Jim?
Yeah, well, and you make a good point. Why would Russia be so interested in him if he was just someone shipping foodstuffs around the world? Nick Payton-Walsh, Fred Pleitgen, thanks so much for both of you. We're joined as well by CNN White House reporter Natasha Bertrand, CNN National Security Analyst David Sanger, CNN Senior Justice Correspondent Evan Perez, and International Diplomatic Editor Nick Robertson. David, the President spoke about Paul Whelan a great deal here and expressed his disappointment and his sympathy for his family's disappointment that he was not part of this deal. He said the Russians said Whelan is different, right? Where is Whelan left now in all this? Who can be traded for him?
You know, not in a good place, Jim. First of all, incredibly joyous moment, huge moment for Biden, I think. And obviously, Brittney Griner is such an iconic figure for so many people that this is what people are going to remember. That makes it in some ways all the tougher for Paul Whelan, who obviously doesn't have that kind of public profile. He's an ex-Marine, has now been in Russian prison for 4 years, is in poor health. And frankly, the one who Putin wanted to get out of this was Viktor Bout. And now that the U.S. does not have him to offer, as Abby and others made the point before, it's going to be a really tough thing to think, what is it that you could give the Russians that would make a difference here? And that makes you begin to think that the only things come outside of prisoner swaps at a moment that Biden knows sooner or later he's going to be in negotiations with Vladimir Putin about Ukraine.
Yeah, no question.
Well, and Nick, to pick up on that Ukraine point, there is a very important question of why now, because none of this is happening without Vladimir Putin saying, okay, go ahead with this. So do we have a sense of, beyond Viktor Bout, what else Putin may be trying to get out of this? Could this be him trying to wage this for some sort of goodwill, as there may or may not be an effort for a diplomatic resolution or some sort of resolution in Ukraine?
I think if you're asking that question to me, look, I think Putin has been trying to get and curry good favor with President Biden for some time, particularly since he annexed those regions in Ukraine, particularly since he's been trying to use that as a defining moment to get peace on the terms that he wants. He knows that exchanging Brittney Griner and not Paul Whelan for Viktor Bout is the better move for Biden. He knows that this is a better play for Biden. It is trying to give Biden something that he wants to improve his relationship with Biden at the moment, and try to get Biden, because he's always seen the United States as the partner to deal with for peace in Ukraine on Putin's terms, that Biden is the one that he wants at the table, not the Ukrainians. So it does seem to kind of fit into that play. And I think it also, the fact that these conversations for this exchange have been going on in the background, despite the war and the tensions, and no space at all for Putin and Biden to meet, no space at all since early in the year for Blinken and Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, to meet. This shows that conversations have been happening and can happen and will likely happen in the future. And I think that is very instructive. But read into this, Putin has given Biden something that he thinks Biden values. And we've just seen the value of it in the White House in the last few minutes.